Okay, you ready?
No, hold on. No.
It's so good to be back here. It really is. And it's just nice to see the old faces and the new faces too. Um, I'm just going to go through the story fairly quickly in some ways, and then I'll answer I'm very open to questions. So if you think of a question, just try to hold on to it, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. And you can ask me anything you want to. I'm an open book. Um, I was born in a small southern mill town. Um, well, I was born out in the country, but we moved to the mill town when I was about 3, and it was very similar to the mill village in Seneca, if any of you have been there. Very much like that. But when I was probably, I don't know, 5 or 6, my parents got involved with a doctor who had come to town, actually from Oconee County, which is interesting. Um, and a group of people started gathering, um, and their primary purpose was to worship Satan. Uh, a small southern town, middle of nowhere, just like any other small southern town. Um, and it went from being fairly simple to being very complicated. But I guess I must have been, I don't know, 4ish when that most of that stuff started. Um, Up to that point, my parents were both. My mother had finished high school. My father hadn't gone to maybe 5th or 6th grade. I'm not sure, but um, he worked in the mill, and she had a secretary type job. But um, we were certainly fairly poor, bottom of the rung, sort of. But I think being what part of this group did for them and what attracted some of the people like them into it was that there was power there. I mean, obviously there was power. There was sex there, and that's always a good thing. And there was you know drugs, because back then in the South there was nothing in the way of drugs. There was alcohol, but nothing in the way of drugs. But the doctor had drugs. So put all those together, and it probably wasn't too difficult to attract certain people, who were looking for something and thought that might be it. And then once you get into it, you find out that you can't leave. That's the stickler. Um, so I don't really remember, or I don't think I ever knew the ins and outs of when they met, how they let people know when they were going to meet, and all that kind of thing. I have memories of different places, out in the country, isolated type old ramshackle buildings, and that kind of thing. Uh, but somehow or another, they would get the word out, to meet. And it was not pretty. They started, like most other things, they get people in, they suck people in for something that appeals to them, and then they start upping the ante. They start making it more and more and more dangerous, you know, uh, and they just sucker people in, and then it gets to be that they are afraid to leave because, you know, rule number one. Well, let me go back just a minute and start with rule number one. Rule number one was, if you tell, you die. And when I was about 4 or 5, somewhere in there, I I went to Sunday school because back in the South, back then in the 40s and 50s, uh, if you didn't go to church, that meant you were not nice. You were not good people. And so everybody went to church somewhere, pretty much, except the real low lifes. And so, the Sunday school teacher was talking about the devil and Satan, and my mouth forever got me in trouble as a kid, forever. And I just piped right up and said I'd seen him. I knew exactly what he looked like. I heard him talk even. Probably what I really had seen was a demon taking over the leader of the group, but that red fiery head and that voice, I mean, an adult would think it was the devil, much less a kid. And so for telling that, they dug a pit in our backyard. They put rattlesnakes in the bottom, or some kind of copperheads. I don't know what kind of snakes, some kind of snakes that would bite in the bottom, and they put me in the pit. I was probably drugged, but there had to be some kind of recall, because when I finally could come up with any memory, all I could come up with was being held. And what I know for a fact now is that Jesus sat and held me, or maybe it wasn't Jesus, maybe it was my guardian angel, or whoever it was. Some being sat and held me all night long. And they pulled me up the next morning thinking it would be my body, and they could just say, oh, well, she wandered out in the woods and got snake bit and died. And I just was smiling. Hi, how are y'all? So that, I'm sure, got their attention. And it just kind of went on from there. I never, life was really hard, but I didn't really understand why it was hard. And there was no love where there should have been love. And, it was just a real mess. But I keep in my mind, I have certain faces of other children that I remember seeing that were in this group of people, the other children that were involved. And there were just some of them, girls especially, who just, it was like you look in their eyes and there's nobody there, just dead eyes. And one of them especially, and I had one incident when I was about 11 that was just absolutely horrible, that I ended up over at the hospital with an infection over, and I remember seeing one of those girls there, and I knew she was dying, because some of them just gave up. They just decided to die. And I don't know why I didn't. I really don't. I mean, I don't know. I've just always had something in me that just would not quit, and it has driven Bill crazy for many years. And I'm sure it drove my my parents crazy, but I just don't quit. And now I know what it is now. It was God. That's exactly what it is. So anyway, after the episode when I was about 11, and you start getting into the time when I would have been old enough to start my period, get pregnant, yada yada yada. So that kind of changes the game up some. I don't know whether the doctor had any sort of birth control that he gave, or I don't have any clue about that. But probably the next really traumatic, one of the worst thing that ever happened mentally to me and to my heart was when I was 17, the week before I, I got pregnant. And I don't know if it was from my father at home or at one of the cult deals or whatever. I don't know. But I just, in the doctor's office in the back room in the middle of the night, and with my aunt and uncle and my mother and dad there and the doctor. And, I had an abortion, and he flushed it down the toilet. And I can hear that toilet flushing. That just absolutely, it took me a long, long time to even remember that, and once I remembered that, it took me a long, long time to even deal with the feelings, that came with that. And so then, and that was at about the same time that I met Bill, and he had grown up outside of our little town, and uh, I I grew up in town, so we didn't go to the same school system, and we lived not far apart, but we'd never met each other. And so we met, our youth groups from both churches, Methodist churches, got together, and that's how we met each other, was at something to do with the youth group. And the first time I saw him, I told the pastor's wife, and pastor's daughter and I were good friends, and I looked at her and I said, him, right there, he's it. I was 16, I guess, at the time. He's it. He had no idea. He was clueless, stayed clueless for many years. But anyway, we, uh, I'm not, I'll go back in just a little bit, but right now I'll keep moving forward in time. Um, I managed to survive somehow that whole episode, and went to college for a couple of years, and we ended up getting married a couple of years after that. And uh, you know our lives together have been, it has just been a roller coaster, a huge roller coaster. Because I had, what I had done, I had a mental function. You could call it a mental illness if you wanted to, but I prefer to call it a mental function that allowed me to, and it's God given, there's no doubt about it, that allowed me to section off all of those memories into little compartments. And then my brain created parts or personalities, whatever you want to call them, that kind of held those memories. Used to be called multiple personality disorder, MPD. Now it's called DID, something identity disorder. Anyway, uh, I like the MPD thing better, but that doesn't really matter. Uh, what happened was that I had no conscious memory of any of this cult stuff. None, zilch, not. It was gone. And so I just lived my life through high school and, college and, just like anybody else, I thought. Um, and we got married and had 2 children, after we had been married for a while. And uh, I, I got into my 30s and it started being impossible for me to handle life. It just, all the threads started unraveling, all over the place. I just could not do it anymore. And I had no idea why. I thought, oh, it had been fine. I didn't have a bad life, bad childhood or anything. Bill thought the same thing. Um, and finally, it got to the point where I couldn't do it anymore. And God just put a series of 3 men in my path who were exactly what I needed. The first one just started with some basic, therapy, psychological therapy kinds of stuff, and to kind of see what problems might be going on. And he got to a point where he goes, I think he went to some seminar, just happened to go to a seminar in Charlotte, North Carolina, and um, heard another therapist talking about working with people who had MPD. And he said, I think you need to go see this guy. I said, okay. So I did, and I saw Robert for 6 or 8 years. I don't know, long time. Sometimes early on, 3 times a week, 3 hours every Wednesday afternoon, 3 hours, Robert's office. He was this huge guy who would just fold himself up onto the floor, and he could talk the scaredest little parts inside of me into coming out and talking to him. These timid little voices that I had. I was totally clueless. And they would tell him all of this stuff, that had gone on. I know it sounds weird. It sounds like a sci-fi kind of thing, but it is very real. And I'm not the only one, I promise you. And so he, over a period of time, just taught me through most of the history. I know there's still lots in there somewhere, but it doesn't need to come out. As much as I needed to know to be able to live a productive life came out, and that's all I need to know. I'm fine with whatever else is in there, can just stay there. If it for some reason ever needs to come out, it will. And I have had some things that would come up from time to time that I'd go, oh, okay, but I can't describe to you how God, this being who is everywhere and does everything, can also be this Jesus who holds a 40-year-old in his lap all night long, to save her life. That's exactly who he is. And, how he found me in a little mill town in South Carolina in the 1950s, who knows? There's no reason that I could see that he would choose me to be that kind of God for, but he did. He gave me a mind that could do that. He gave me a heart that could do that. He just made me to be able to live through what I lived through so that I can come and sit here and talk to y'all. Um, I mean, I thought for a long time it was just for me, just so I could survive, because I was purely in survival mode. We spent years in survival mode, uh, and it has taken a long time. It's been years now since I have been in survival mode, and I don't want to go back there. But if for some reason he decides at some point there's more you need to know, child, then he'll tell me, and I'll go. Uh, I guess, let me think and see if there's any other of the, I guess one other event that I wanted to talk about was um, when I was right after, well, I didn't, I'll tell you kind of what point I just, one day I woke up, I was in my right about 40, late 30s, just right about 40. And I decided that that was the day that I was going to kill myself. I already knew how I was going to do it, where I was going to do it. Everything was good to go. Today's the day, unless something changes. And this voice in my head said, go to the church. I'm like, go to the church? What church? I thought, the Methodist church. But no, 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 no. And so then a little while later, it was like, the church. And I got this picture in my mind, and it was actually a Quaker church outside of town, and I had worked with a young guy who had helped start it. And it just seemed like a nice church, but we didn't go to church. We didn't have anything to do with God, I didn't think. And that just wasn't part of our lifestyle. We had lived a very worldly, free-for-all kind of lifestyle. And it was just about to come to an abrupt halt. God was going to say, enough of this. And he did. Uh, when I called the church and I told the secretary, she answered the phone. And I later met her, and she told me how scared she was after she talked to me, because I said, I'm going to kill myself today if I cannot talk to somebody. And she said, just a minute. And the pastor was there, and I went and talked to him, and he led me to the Lord. And we went to that church for, several years. And it finally got to be where we were the oldest Christians there. And we were like, other than the pastor and his family. And we're like, this isn't good, because we're brand new at this still, we need a place where there are lots of older believers that can help us. So we found another place, a church where a bunch of missionaries go, and past retired missionaries and current ones or whatever. And so we started going there and loved it. And that's where we really got a solid foundation in what it means to follow Jesus, what it means to be a believer. And so our lives just did an absolute, we just came to a screeching halt in the direction that we were going, and turned immediately in the opposite direction. Our families did not like it. My family in particular did not like it. I had no contact with them whatsoever, with none of them. Cousins, not only, mother or father. My father had already died. My mother was alive. My brother was alive. But no cousins, aunts, uncles, nobody. No contact whatsoever after they found out that we were believers. And so it was just, a whole new life. And shortly after that, after we were saved, I met this young woman. We had given up, we stopped everything, but I was still having trouble with giving up the alcohol. Uh, and so I went to an AA meeting in our town. I thought, this isn't going to work, because it was just aunts, uncles, cousins, everybody that I knew was there. I'm like, no, this is not going to work. So I found another one in another town. Uh, and uh, that, I stopped drinking, no drugs, no nothing. Uh, Pot was the only drug that there was back then, but none of that, no nothing. And um, I met this young woman at an AA meeting for women. And she told me that she did this guided meditation thing, and that it was really cool, and that you could really, really learn a lot about yourself. And I thought, okay. So I went to her house one afternoon, and she's put on some music and lit a candle, and we did this yada 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 thing. And it didn't bother me, but it didn't do anything for me. It was like, well, okay, whatever. And so I thanked her, and I was getting ready to go. We were standing in her living room, and she started to reach out to hug me. And I promise I'm not crazy, but over her head in flashing red letters was evil, evil, evil. And this stench, this horrible stench came up, and I don't remember how I got out of the house. I don't remember getting in my car. The next thing I knew I was in my car and shaking like a leaf, locking all the doors. And I don't even know how I drove home. I was a wreck. So since that experience, and then after that, from there, I learned a whole lot more as therapy progressed about what had gone on, when I was a child. And so I just became very phobic about anything, absolutely anything that smacked of satanic, cult, whatever. And I want, if you get nothing whatsoever out of anything that I said, I want you to understand that it is real. It is just as real as y'all are sitting here right now. There is a devil. There is Satan. Now, on the other hand, there is God. But, Satan wants people, and you would not believe the people who actually buy into it, to believe that he's it. He's not it. God's eventually going to put an end to that. But for now, he's alive and well, and he is taking down anybody he can. Especially, one of his targets is people who might be interested in hearing about Jesus. So, like it or not, we all in some fashion or another are moving targets for the enemy. And, even those of us who have been believers for a long, long time, still have to be careful and cautious about what we read, what we see, what we allow ourselves to hear, sometimes it's even what I smell. I'll have a smell come up and I'll go, it's just like this instant revulsion, because it takes me back to some place I do not want to go. But anyway, that being said, I, went through therapy and got to a fairly, reasonable place. And absolutely with the Lord, no doubt about it. wouldn't have survived without that. And um, so we have, our kids are grown now. We have grandkids who are, our oldest grandkids are the age of some of y'all sitting around here now. Uh, and uh, we have been very open and honest with all of them, kids, grandkids, everybody. Uh, I'm waiting. So far, none of the grandkids have really come to me and ask a whole lot of questions. I hope they do. At least a few of them do. But I don't know if they will or not. Um, but life now is, I just can't tell you what life I should not be living the life that I live now. I should have been dead long ago, or I should just be this horrible person who's, miserable to myself and everybody else. Um, but I'm not. I am perfectly fine, relatively sane, relatively healthy. Um, and Bill and I have been married for 56 years, and, uh, you know, he hadn't killed me yet, and I haven't killed him yet, so we've done really well. Uh,